a tremendous amount of adult cognitive computation to solve, like what do we do about the borders? Because tearing them down is not the answer. Well, the person who stands up and says, well, I see someone who's hurt by a border and I feel empathy for them, then immediately says, therefore I'm good, which isn't so bad, but therefore I'm also morally superior to you. And this is one of the true pathologies of the empathic collectivists, is that they presume that their reflexive empathy marks them out as morally superior. And that's appalling, because part of it is, A, it's too easy. Just because I feel sorry for you doesn't mean I'm good. Partly because I can feel so sorry for you that I'm actually harmful to you. And that's what happens in the case of overprotective parents, for example. So we know perfectly well that empathy is not an untrammeled moral virtue. It has to be tempered by other virtues, and carefully tempered by other virtues. And so we have to stop allowing in our public discourse the unquestioned assumption that just because I manifest more pity in the moment than you do, that I'm somehow a morally superior individual. Yes. In fact, not only do we have to question that, we in fact have to deeply question it and say, what makes you think that you're just not taking things too far right there? Because there's just as much error on the side of too much empathy as there is on the side of too little empathy. And that's a hard thing for everyone to learn, because empathy feels so good. Like if you feel mercy towards a suffering child, it's like, that is kind of an indication that you're an ethical person. But that's not the basis for complex and sophisticated foreign policy.
Well, we know it isn't, because we know our empathy diminishes in an almost linear way with the numbers of people to empathize with, right? So we spoke about this one night in Vancouver, but this has been tested, where if you tell someone about the plight of one little girl, you will elicit the maximum empathic response and the maximum of an altruistic response. They'll give the most amount of money they're going to give to any cause to one compelling story to save one little boy or girl. But if you start adding boys and girls to the one, keeping the one the same, people's empathy degrades and their altruism degrades. So empathy is non-quantitative almost by definition.
It's also partly because in your life, if you see a person in trouble, you might be able to do something about them. But if you see a million people in trouble, what you should probably do, at least to begin with, is run. And I mean, what are you going to do? Maybe you could give $1,000 to one person, but if you divided that up among a million, all that would happen would you would have no money, and they wouldn't be any better off.
But this is to say that so much of moral progress today entails unhooking from the highly salient empathy-driving story and connecting with the actual quantitative reality, to learn that it's 500,000 people dying every year from heart disease or whatever it is, or there's 500,000 people dying in this famine. The fact that can't be made sexy for our news cycle, right? The fact that we lose attention is something we have to figure out how to correct.
Well, it's also akin. It's very interestingly akin to your objection that you raised before, is that there are adult forms of solving problems that aren't akin to children's play, which is something, by the way, I agree with, because I don't think that the manner in which children organize the world is the end of the way that things should be organized. It's the basis for some of the organization. But this is akin to the same issue, is that the basal motivational responses, the emotional responses, no matter how well-meaning, aren't of sufficient conceptual sophistication to deal with incredibly elaborate and complex systems. And then you have another problem too, is that, well, that's really troublesome for people, because they want to do the right thing globally. And then you tell them, look, you don't know anything. You don't know how to take this insanely complicated system that we have and improve it. And just because you're feeling pity doesn't mean that you're an expert in the retooling of hydroelectric systems, for example.
And there's one straightforward way to do that. I mean, I'll give you an example. There's a brilliant Kurdish demographer who's a Swedish citizen now, who cited this fact that it costs the same amount to bring one refugee and keep them in Sweden as it does to look after 100 refugees in Jordan, Turkey, or Lebanon. Okay. So the obvious thing from that is you say, look, it's madness then to be, for instance, bringing in thousands of refugees to Sweden. You could be looking after hundreds of thousands of people in the region. Why is that still a tainted argument? It's because people aren't sure you're not going to smuggle in racism with that. That's why.
Right.
I think, are you sure you're not just coming up with this demographer
Right,
stuff in order to...
It's like you're smuggling in Hitler, like
Yeah,
the
exactly.
religious type smuggle in Jesus.
You're going to start with NGO figures, and before we know it, it's Auschwitz. That's what they think.
Right.
But here's the thing. The shortcut solution to answering almost every single one of these problems is assume that your interlocutor has good motives.
Yeah.
Assume that they are being honest in the way that they're looking at it. And that's why I
I
say...
have a comment about that. Okay, so this is something I deal with in my clinical practice all the time. Okay, so imagine that you're naive. And then what you are when you're naive is someone who thinks you trust people because you think everybody has good motivations, which is some sense what Douglas is recommending. And they say, well, that's just naive. It's like, just wait a second, though. Because here's the developmental pathway. First, you're naive and you trust everyone. And then someone cuts you off at the knees. Or multiple people do. Or maybe you cut yourself off at the knees because you trusted yourself too much and you didn't take into account the malevolence that lurks in your heart and the hearts of others. And so that you get traumatized by betrayal. And then you become cynical. And you think, Jesus, I'm a lot smarter now that I'm cynical. And you are, because cynical is actually a move up on naive. But it's not the last move. The last move is to transcend cynicism and to say that even though I know that there are just as many snakes in your heart as there are in my heart, I'm going to hold out my hand in trust because that's the best way to elevate both of us. And that is the prerequisite for a sensible discussion.
And to concede that, this is why I'm always going on about Aristotle on this, to concede that it's not between good and evil, but between competing virtues. That when it comes to something like the borders discussion, you're dealing with justice and mercy. You cannot only be driven by one of those virtues.
That's right.
Mercy
both.
itself will lead you to hell.
Yep.
Justice on its own, blind.
Yes.
Wow. Unbelievable stuff by three absolutely brilliant men. Unbelievable stuff there. I mean, I could probably spend an hour or more talking about that segment and the individual, the individual statements and the individual theorems and axioms that they came up with. But I just want to go a little bit by little bit, take a little bit of time to give my reaction. When Jordan Peterson was talking about that, all encompassed to me was the virtue signaling that occurs. And you see that happening so often, from the leftist perspective, from the liberal perspective, from the progressive perspective. Because virtue signaling, along with tough love, it's easy to basically say, hey, we're going to do whatever we can for everybody and everything, and money is no object. And we all know that that's just not true. Money is a finite amount that you can spend on a certain situation, a certain problem. I mean, you just can't throw... And then the thing is that somebody says that doesn't matter. Whatever you need to do it. That doesn't make any sense. But the virtue signaling that comes from the left is so intense that it makes everybody else feel bad because they're saying, oh, boy, that person, he's saying something nice. He's saying he's going to do whatever it takes. And you're thinking, well, maybe you don't have what that person is saying, but then you don't really know if that person is actually following through with it. People just talk with their mouth. It's like when people go, whenever they have, fundraisers, a lot of times you say, well, how much money did you collect? Well, why didn't you collect all of it? Well, there were a lot of people that pledged, but they never came through. So in a group setting, you see people raising up their hands. Yeah, I'll pledge $100,000. I'll pledge $20,000. I'll pledge $50,000. I'll pledge, $1,000. And you may be thinking over there, wow, you know what? All these people are pledging money. I don't got that kind of money, or I can't give that kind of money for something like this. Then you find out the person next to you that pledged, $10,000 never paid. But it sure felt good for him to raise up his hand and say that. I mean, so the virtue signaling, the polishing of halos is unbelievable. And then to Sam's point, the inverse proportionality of how we feel empathy, that's pretty true. You hear that one story. I mean, look at what that one story moved of that child that washed up on the shores, I think in Syria or whatever. And it literally, it's been told that had President Trump's daughter, Ivanka, in tears. And she said, something needs to be done. Look at what happens when you've got one person, one main person, Greta Thunberg, who exhorts the plight of climate change in the Church of Climatology and has a moving story as a teenager at the United Nations, and everybody feels, and now the money comes pouring in. People want to have their pictures taken with, it's just, right? The virtue signaling begins immediately. If you attack, she's a 16-year-old girl. She's got a medical condition, Asperger's. What? Why are we attacking, under the age? You should be ashamed of it. You should be doing this. You shouldn't be doing that. And then Jordan brings up the fact about mercy and justice and how they should be meted out. Just if you're merciful, it depends in terms of every situation is going to be different. But if you're merciful in one situation, how can you be merciful in some others as well? That's going to be very difficult. And then justice has to occur. Well, where do you bring justice into all of this? So I could go on and on and on. Anyways, folks, we appreciate you taking the time to watch. You've been watching the Dr. Nasir Shaikh Show. I've been your host. My name is Dr. Nasir. If you haven't done so already, we'd love for you to subscribe to this channel. Like, share, and follow us. You all know what to do. Take a look at our other video links above and below. Put your thoughts down and let us know what you think in the comments. My final thought is always, when you're right, you're right. And when you're left, you're wrong. Until next time, folks, take care and stay safe.